Hi everybody, welcome to the Chapter 1 online lecture. Before I discuss the chapter material, I'd like you to make note of a couple of things. First of all, these video lectures won't take the place of your reading the book. I'll be highlighting certain elements of the chapter and providing examples of some concepts, but this won't take the place of actually doing the reading. When you do your assignments and exams, you'll need to be able to draw on all of the chapter material. Plus, it's a great book and I think you're really going to find it interesting. Some students have told me that they usually sell back all their books, but they're keeping this one because it's a great handbook for leadership. So I think you'll actually enjoy the reading. How long will it take for you to read a chapter? Of course, that depends on your reading speed. I reread them every semester and each chapter takes me about an hour. I'm a fast reader and I'm already familiar with the material, but maybe that'll help you to judge. You'll know best about your own habits. So let's take a look at some highlights of Chapter 1. The first point our authors make is that communication is symbolic and that this is important to leadership communication. So what does this mean? Well, the first thing it means is that symbols represent reality. All the words on the left represent the object on the right. No matter whether you understand the language or the alphabet, each of those symbols represents that thing. So the symbol connects to an idea. So given that communication is symbolic, meaning is generated through communication. When I say the word barn, you have a picture in your mind of what I mean. So then the goal of communication is to create a shared reality through the transfer of those symbols. Stephen King, the author of the horror novels, tells a great story in one of his other books called On Writing, which is a great book. I really recommend it. He describes the process he goes through when he's writing fiction. And he says, I want to try a little experiment. Do this with me. Picture a little round table with a white tablecloth on it, and on that table is a glass aquarium. And inside the aquarium is a white rabbit with pink eyes. And that rabbit is holding a carrot in its front paws and munching on the carrot. Then he says, you know what I just did? That was telepathy. I took a picture from my mind and transferred it into your mind. Now, you might not have envisioned it exactly the same way I did, but through communication, through this transfer of symbols, I created a reality for you that is similar to the reality that I was thinking about. I transferred an idea from my head into yours. That's a great example of how communication is symbolic. So, given that communication is symbolic, what does that mean specifically for leaders? Well, in this course, we're defining leadership as a process of social influence. Leaders create a reality for their followers in symbolic ways through that use of symbols that I was just describing. Words are not the only symbols a leader might use. There's the whole package of who the leader is. The way they dress, their tone of voice, the way they behave toward followers, their general demeanor, your expectations of them, all of those create a reality for followers. Let's take a closer look at that idea. Make yourself a note to go through pages 7 and 8 of the textbook. In this section, our authors have given us a number of little stories or anecdotes about how leaders behaved in certain situations, and each of those stories really gives you an idea of what that person would be like as a leader. So for each of those scenarios, consider how their behavior is symbolic of their leadership style. Let's take a look at the first one. The first one is about a leader named Don Isley, and it talks about how he parks his car in front of the building. Okay, so that's a particular behavior that this leader is exhibiting. So when you read that story, ask yourself, how is his parking choice symbolic of his leadership style? Because of this choice, how would you expect him to behave in other leadership situations? And then ask yourself if you can think of a situation where somebody behaved in a similar manner and what that message conveyed to you. Go through the same process with each of those stories on page 7 and 8 and ask yourself how their choice is symbolic of the way they would be as a leader. A lot of aspects of self-presentation kind of come together in a package to say something about a leader. One example is dress. Does the leader dress the same as their followers? Do they dress up? Do they dress down? Think about how the President of the United States dresses in various situations. He might wear a suit and tie one time and then wear more casual clothing in a different context. All of that is part of the package of communicating something to other people. Think about your professors. Some might dress up every day, some might dress down. I had a professor at Ohio University who was famous for Hawaiian shirts and sandals. All of that is part of a leader's packaging and the message that they want to convey to their followers. Another one is tone of voice. Someone who's soft-spoken versus speaking loudly. Someone who's always speaking in a rushed and breathless manner. All of those things say something about how that person views others. Office decor is a fun one. Some people have a very stark, empty office with only the papers they're working on the desk in front of them. Others have offices that are so cluttered you wonder how they can find anything. You've probably visited various professors during office hours and noticed that some of us have a lot of plants and pictures and bookcases full of books and things like that, whereas others have a very minimalist decor. Those kinds of things can tell you something about what a person is like as a leader. And gestures. What kind of movements, body movements, does a person make? Do they walk with a confident stride? Do they fidget when they're talking? All of those things kind of come together in a package to convey a message about a person, whether they're aware of it or not, and whether it's deliberate or not. We can learn to manage these things if we want to convey a certain message about ourselves. We'll be spending a lot of time this semester talking about good leadership, but it's important also to look at bad leadership. What makes a person a bad leader? So think about some characteristics of bad leaders that you've known as we continue through this section. Bad leaders exhibit a lot of different traits. One is that they tend to think more about themselves than their followers. A bad leader might be more concerned about his or her own chances for advancement in the company or their own convenience in different situations, and aren't that concerned about those things for their followers, right? Their followers' chance for advancement, their followers' convenience is not a priority to them. Bad leaders make poor decisions, and the consequences of those decisions reveal them as poor decisions. Bad leaders are often inflexible. To them, there might be only one right way of doing things, and they're not willing to listen to alternatives or get feedback from their followers about better ways of doing things. Bad leaders often lack self-control. One big example of that in a leadership situation is losing your temper with your followers. And bad leaders are just often uncaring or unkind toward their followers. They see their followers as a means to an end, as cogs in the machine, and aren't able to take an interest in followers on a personal level. I'm sure you can think of quite a few more from bad leaders that you've known. I encourage you to review these pages 14 through 19 carefully as you're going to be using these concepts in an upcoming assignment. The next concept I'd like to highlight for you is the difference between management and leadership. We tend to use these words interchangeably. We talk about a manager or a boss or a leader, and those words don't all have the same meaning. There is an important difference between management and leadership. Here's an example of the difference between management and leadership. Imagine that you've been hired by McDonald's Corporation. Imagine you've been hired as a manager of the local McDonald's restaurant. So think about what some of your duties would be as a manager of that local restaurant versus if you were hired as a corporate officer of McDonald's. What would some of your duties be then, and how would those duties differ from the duties of that restaurant manager? Let's explore this a little further. First, let's look at managers. Managers primarily focus on the day-to-day operations. Using that McDonald's example again, if you were hired as a restaurant manager, your primary responsibility would be the day-to-day operations of that McDonald's restaurant. You're in the trenches with the employees, carrying out the day-to-day duties of the operation. And you're carrying out the decisions or directives of other people, right? You're carrying out the decisions or directives of leaders. You have a limited amount of authority for deciding how things should be done. There's probably an operations manual. There's a procedure for everything. There are certain ingredients that go in a quarter pounder with cheese and a certain procedure for making it. And your duty is to make sure that they get made properly. So you're carrying out the directives of others there. And any choices that you make have to conform to the guidelines that other people have set for you. So you do have a certain amount of decision-making authority, but there are parameters around that. We can contrast that with what leaders do. Leaders are more focused on the big picture, taking the long view, and making strategic decisions. So in our example of McDonald's, this person would be looking at what is good for the corporation overall, where does the corporation want to be in 5 years, things like that. These leaders might not always be involved in the day-to-day routine. They might be aware of it and they know what happens in the trenches with the regular employees or the worker bees, as we might call them, but they're not always involved in that day-to-day routine. Their job is to step back and make overarching plans that are going to be for the good of everyone in the long run. So I want to raise a question with you. Is promoting from within always a good idea? We think of it as a positive thing, but it can be problematic. A person who's really good at the day-to-day aspects of their job may not always be able to translate that into a leadership position where they have to take a more hands-off approach, a more long-term strategic view of things. Sometimes you promote from within and that person is having a hard time letting go of their day-to-day operational activities. Other times they're just not able to take that more strategic view. Perhaps you've been in work situations where someone was promoted from within and it didn't work out well. This might be the reason why, because management and leadership are two different things. They require different skills, and not everyone is able to do both of those. Leaders aren't always good managers either. It works the other way too. Our expectations about how leaders should behave are very much culturally based. Americans and Westerners tend to expect our leaders to be outgoing and outspoken because those are qualities that we as a culture tend to value. When someone's going on a job interview, we tell them you have to have a firm handshake, you have to speak with authority, and traits like that. But other cultures might value more slow, deliberate decision making or a more paternal leadership style. A couple of years ago, a book came out called Quiet: The Secret Power of Introverts by an author named Susan Cain. It's very good. I really recommend it. In that book, Susan Cain talks about how our culture tends to overvalue outspokenness, assertiveness, and traits like that. We see those as strong. Whereas if a person is quieter, more inward, more of a thinker, more soft-spoken, we tend to look at those traits as weak. And in her book, she contends that we really undervalue people that way, and we miss out on some great potential leaders by overvaluing what we consider those strong traits. It's an interesting thing to think about. Our textbook authors talk about the importance of storytelling in leadership and how leadership is shaped by narrative. The stories that leaders tell about themselves and about their organization, and the stories that we tell each other about our leaders that shape our ideas about them. These stories that we tell each other in an organization become part of the organizational folklore. There's certain stories and legends that go along with working for different organizations. One great example is Disney. When Walt Disney was alive, there was a saying among employees that Walt's always in the park. So if you worked at Disneyland, there was the idea that he could be anywhere. He could walk up at any minute, and you wanted to behave properly because you didn't want to disappoint this iconic leader in your organization. After Walt Disney died, they kept up that idea of Walt's always in the park, but the idea now is that he's watching you from the great hereafter. But it's part of their organizational folklore that Walt is always watching, so you better do things properly. Leaders use stories like that to shape followers' thoughts and their expectations. And followers use them to inform others. These stories get passed along from one follower to another. So think about some stories that you've been told when you join a new organization and the stories that you've passed on to others. Maybe when you join an organization, you ask somebody, what's Joe like? Let's say Joe is the department head. What's he like? And they tell you a story. They say, oh, you should have seen him at the Christmas party this year. He dressed up as Santa Claus and passed out presents to everybody, and he was laughing. And through that story, you take it that, okay, this is a fun place to work. Joe has a positive relationship with his followers. Ideas like that. Think about how these stories, like Walt's always in the park or Joe played Santa at the Christmas party, think about how those are symbolic in shaping the organizational culture. Those are some highlights from the chapter. Make sure you read it thoroughly, take good notes, and make sure you check the task list for your assignment this week. I'll see you in the next module.